Right in the middle of our lavish Christmas night gala, I stood completely frozen in the grand arched doorway, while 200 extended relatives turned in absolute unison to stare dead at me, completely silent and highly expectant, exactly like I had just blindly walked into my very own public execution. My mother aggressively gripped my framed childhood photos in her manicured hands and, without even blinking an eye, violently smashed them straight against the imported marble floor. My father slowly unfolded a crisp white sheet of paper, dramatically cleared his throat, and announced loudly enough for the crystal chandeliers to physically vibrate, stating that this was my official bill for every single red cent they had entirely wasted raising me, totaling exactly $248,000, and telling me to either pay it in full or absolutely never contact them again. The entire crowded room collectively exhaled all at once while a remarkably slow, ice-cold wave of dread aggressively rolled straight through my tight chest. My name is Alyssa Warren, I am 29 years old, and up until that horrific night, I actually genuinely believed my toxic family's profound cruelty had some kind of logical limit, but I was spectacularly wrong. I vividly remember the heavy smell of expensive cinnamon holiday candles, sickeningly mixing with the sharp, metallic scent of broken glass shattered on the floor. My golden child sister, Mia, smugly strutted right toward me in her glittering red designer dress, violently snatched my car keys straight off the entryway table, and stated with a vicious smirk that sliced significantly deeper than any butcher knife that Dad had already legally transferred the title to her, so I absolutely didn't need them anymore. Various relatives loudly whispered in the background, some clearly amused by the spectacle, some looking highly uncomfortable, but absolutely none of them brave enough to actually step up to the plate and defend me. I actively felt my throat dangerously tighten, absolutely not with pathetic tears, but rather with something significantly colder, which was pure, unadulterated recognition. They absolutely weren't punishing me for anything bad I had actually done to them, but rather they were aggressively punishing me for exactly who I flat-out refused to become, which was an obedient, perpetually silent daughter who was endlessly grateful for their leftover crumbs. Then something exponentially darker aggressively unfolded right in front of my eyes. My father smugly motioned toward the very back of the massive dining hall, and my actual corporate boss stepped right forward wearing a tailored winter coat, completely refusing to even look me directly in the eye. He quietly muttered that my parents had explicitly told him absolutely everything, and that he was officially letting me go from the firm, effective immediately. Cruel laughter abruptly erupted at the far dining table, and someone loudly muttered that I was finally getting exactly what I deserved for being such a massive disappointment. The ambient lights in the room suddenly felt significantly hotter and infinitely harsher, making my own skin feel entirely too tight for my skeleton. I absolutely didn't try to frantically defend myself. I certainly didn't scream at the top of my lungs, and I absolutely refused to crumble under their coordinated attack. My absolute silence was my ultimate dignity, and it was the very last precious thing they hadn't successfully stolen from me yet. My mother aggressively leaned in close, her toxic voice absolutely dripping with sickening victory, explicitly telling me to heavily consider this a permanent lesson and demanding that if I walked out that door tonight, I was never to come back. So, I proudly turned on my heel and walked straight out of their massive house, completely walking away from their suffocating expectations and their meticulously orchestrated public humiliation without shedding a single tear. Exactly 4 days later, my cell phone unexpectedly started buzzing absolutely relentlessly, logging over 50 missed calls a day from the exact same narcissistic family who had just publicly thrown me away like garbage. And finally, on the agonizing 5th day, one specific frantic voicemail completely flipped the entire script and changed absolutely everything. It was a violently trembling voice, desperately whispering my name, telling me it was my sister and that something was horribly, terribly wrong. Mia literally never called my phone unless she desperately needed me to fix something for her, so actively hearing her shaky voice whisper that something was wrong felt exactly like a freezing ghost, gently brushing against my ear in the dark. I absolutely didn't call her back right away, deciding to just sit on the edge of my cheap mattress in my incredibly tiny studio apartment, which was the miserable place I had dragged myself to right after being abruptly fired, deeply humiliated, and systematically stripped of absolutely everything I owned. And I just quietly listened to that frantic voicemail again. Her heavy breathing was incredibly uneven and choked with genuine panic, desperately begging me to call her back because they absolutely wouldn't tell her anything that was going on. By they, I immediately knew she meant my parents, the exact same cruel people who had eagerly paraded my deep shame around like cheap holiday entertainment, the ones who had violently ripped my photos off the wall, exactly as if aggressively erasing my face might magically rewrite their own profound failures as parents. I casually tossed my phone aside onto the blanket, but it violently buzzed again, officially marking the 50-second missed call of the day. I comfortably let it ring completely out, letting my boiling anger remain incredibly thick and perfectly steady inside my chest. They absolutely didn't want anything to do with me 4 short days ago, so why on earth were they jumping the gun to reach me right now? But exactly as the quiet night slowly settled in, the dark memories actively clawed their way back to the absolute front of my mind. Growing up in that house, our family wasn't ever cruel in a loud, violently chaotic way, but rather it was an incredibly quiet cruelty, perfectly polished and deeply rehearsed for the public eye. My parents were exactly the type of people who smiled incredibly wide for perfect Christmas photos and then aggressively shredded your self-esteem entirely behind closed doors just for blinking wrong in their presence. My father absolutely despised any signs of imperfection. My mother completely hated any hint of disobedience, and my sister Mia simply adapted to survive them. She eagerly became their ultimate golden child, their perfect little echo, always incredibly pretty, highly compliant, and acting exactly like their prized trophy. I was the exact opposite of her, remaining way too fiercely independent, far too outspoken, and entirely unwilling to desperately shape myself into something purely decorative, just to appease their fragile egos. They barely tolerated my existence until the exact night they completely weaponized Christmas dinner, inviting 200 extended relatives just to put my name on absolutely everyone's tongue and completely dismantle my entire life in under 20 agonizing minutes. But what those arrogant people absolutely didn't realize was that while they successfully raised Mia to blindly obey, they inadvertently raised me to fiercely survive any nuclear fallout. That entire night, I obsessively replayed absolutely every single moment of that deep humiliation, specifically remembering my mom aggressively smashing my photos, my dad arrogantly announcing my massive fake bill, and my spineless boss explicitly firing me right in front of total strangers. And directly underneath the burning sting of it all, something entirely new was rapidly forming in my mind, which was a massive, glaring question about why they were suddenly so incredibly desperate to reach me. Extended relatives absolutely don't change their true colors overnight, and toxic abusers absolutely don't suddenly grow a conscience out of thin air. No, something massive had definitely happened, something significantly big enough to completely crack their incredibly proud, pristine facade. By the very next morning, I calmly made myself a steaming cup of incredibly cheap instant coffee, sat down on the cold floor with a blanket tightly wrapped around my shoulders, and finally opened my phone to check my messages. There was exactly one new voicemail, but it wasn't Mia this time. It was actually my father, and his usually booming voice sounded incredibly tight, highly urgent, and almost genuinely frightened. He desperately stated that I urgently needed to come back home immediately because it was directly about the massive family estate and we desperately needed to talk before it was too late. He actually paused for a second, which was something I had absolutely never heard in his highly controlled voice before, and then he desperately begged, saying please. Hearing the word please explicitly coming from him was a massive, glaring red flag, serving as a desperate warning rather than a simple request, and I deeply felt it in my bones. Something incredibly huge was rapidly unraveling behind the scenes. I completely refused to respond immediately, actively letting my father's desperate plea just sit heavily in the air exactly like a highly foreign object that didn't belong. That arrogant man had absolutely never begged for a single thing in his entire life, certainly not for my presence, and absolutely not from anyone else, because he always acted exactly like a military general rather than a loving parent, operating completely like a ruthless commander instead of a nurturing caregiver. Hearing pure desperation aggressively leaking into his voice felt entirely unnatural, exactly like quietly watching a massive mountain violently tremble during an earthquake. But by exactly noon, right after 3 more completely unanswered calls, another frantic voicemail arrived, and this specific time it was from someone I hadn't actually heard from in several years. It was my Aunt Caroline, who was literally the absolute only relative in that toxic bloodline who had ever actually treated me like a real human being instead of a massive burden. Her voice was violently quivering as she quickly whispered that my parents were in incredibly serious legal trouble and that they desperately needed my help right now. She explicitly warned me that my father absolutely wouldn't tell me the whole truth about the situation, but she begged me to call her back immediately because it was directly related to the massive family inheritance. Hearing the word inheritance completely shocked me because my family had aggressively spent decades constantly reminding me that I absolutely had zero claim to a single dime of their money. For a brief moment, genuine confusion entirely cracked the solid wall of anger actively boiling inside me. I aggressively paced my incredibly small apartment, my nervous fingers rapidly tapping my thighs while my heart started beating entirely too fast in my chest. Something incredibly serious was actively happening entirely behind those heavily guarded mansion walls, something they absolutely couldn't spin to the media or seamlessly hide with their usual toxic manipulation tactics. Still, even after absolutely everything they had just done to destroy my life, why on earth should I actually care what happened to them? I absolutely didn't owe them any kindness. I certainly didn't owe them any comfort, and I absolutely didn't owe them any salvation from whatever massive disaster they had clearly created for themselves. I literally owed them absolutely nothing, but I actively realized that I did heavily owe something to myself, which was absolute clarity, final closure, and concrete answers. So, I finally picked up my phone and directly called Mia, and she desperately picked up the line instantly on the very first ring. She hysterically cried out my name, profusely thanking God that I finally answered, and frantically tried to explain that Mom and Dad were completely losing their minds. Her voice violently cracked in a pathetic way I had absolutely never heard before, because Mia had lived her entire existence, highly polished, perfectly poised, and flawlessly perfect. Tonight, however, she sounded exactly like a terrified child whose entire sheltered world was aggressively collapsing right on top of her. I asked her exactly what had happened, actively keeping my own voice significantly steadier than I actually felt inside. She inhaled incredibly shakily and admitted that she didn't know all the exact details, but stated that Dad had been aggressively locked inside his private study for 2 entire days straight. She explained that Mom just kept crying uncontrollably in the hallways and that highly intimidating people kept showing up unannounced at the front door, specifically naming high-powered lawyers, corporate bankers, and severe people she had absolutely never seen before in her life. She cried that every single time she desperately asked what was going on, Dad viciously yelled at her to mind her own business and stay completely out of it. I slowly asked her exactly why they suddenly wanted me involved if things were so incredibly bad at the house. Mia hesitated for a brief second before desperately whispering that Dad explicitly said something about me being the absolute only person on earth who could legally fix this massive mess. My resulting laugh was incredibly sharp and deeply disbelieving, specifically pointing out that they had just aggressively fired me, legally disowned me, and deeply humiliated me in front of our entire bloodline, and now they magically thought I was their ultimate solution. She desperately whispered my name again, begging me to just come over because they were entirely terrified of whatever was coming. Hearing the specific word terrified instantly settled incredibly deep in my chest because my arrogant parents absolutely weren't afraid of anything on this earth. So, whatever this specific crisis actually was, it was exponentially bigger than public humiliation and significantly bigger than simple family control. Something absolutely catastrophic was aggressively barreling toward them, and somehow I was securely locked right at the absolute center of it all. I absolutely didn't decide to go back there out of any sense of familial love, but rather I went back strictly because something deep in my gut actively whispered the brutal truth to me. Toxic people exactly like my parents only ever urgently call the specific child they viciously disowned when they are actively drowning and need a human raft. Their massive mansion sat high on the hill, exactly like a severely frostbitten monument, looking completely silent, incredibly dark, and entirely uninviting to the world. On Christmas night, it had been brightly glowing, incredibly loud, and heavily packed full of 200 arrogant people actively watching my deep humiliation, exactly like it was a fun holiday festival. Now, however, all of its massive windows were completely pitch black, and even the expensive holiday wreath hanging on the front door looked incredibly wilted and dead. I confidently stepped right inside the grand foyer without even bothering to knock, immediately noticing that the ambient air felt incredibly thick, exactly like heavy grief, pure panic, and like something had literally rotted right beneath the polished hardwood floorboards. The older housekeeper nervously glanced at me with incredibly wide eyes but absolutely didn't dare to speak a single word. Instead, she just silently pointed a trembling finger directly toward the upstairs hallway. I easily found my mother first, sitting pathetically right on floor of the main hallway, her expensive mascara heavily streaked down her face, her perfect hair completely undone, and desperately clutching one of the exact same childhood photos she had aggressively ripped off the wall just 4 short days ago. She looked incredibly small and fragile, and I had absolutely never seen her look that small in my entire life. She breathlessly whispered my name exactly, as if I were a magical hallucination, desperately asking if I had actually come to save them. I quietly stated that I absolutely didn't come back for her, and coldly demanded to know exactly where Dad was hiding. Her bottom lip violently trembled as she weakly pointed directly toward his heavy wooden study doors, and I confidently walked right past her without a second glance. Deep inside the dimly lit study, my father nervously stood right at his massive mahogany desk, completely surrounded by open legal folders, scattered financial papers, and 3 incredibly thick envelopes, prominently stamped with a major corporate bank's official logo. His physical posture, which was usually incredibly rigid and highly superior, was aggressively hunched over in total defeat. He slowly lifted his tired eyes, and for the absolute first time in my entire adult life, he looked genuinely, profoundly scared of me. He completely paused for a second before desperately stating that we urgently needed to talk right now. I casually crossed my arms over my chest and coldly commanded him to start talking if he had something to say. He swallowed incredibly hard and frantically explained that absolutely all of our family accounts, the entire massive estate, and absolutely everything they owned was currently being aggressively challenged in federal court. He stated that there were massive legal claims actively being placed on expensive assets that they foolishly thought were entirely secure from outside interference. I flatly demanded that he speak to me in plain English, and he aggressively snapped back that they were currently being sued for absolutely everything they had. Then, dropping his voice much softer, he admitted that the massive lawsuit was being entirely driven by my late grandfather's personal team of estate lawyers. That specific revelation hit me exactly like a massive physical slap to the face, considering my grandfather had been completely dead for over 7 years. He nervously looked away and admitted that it was entirely true, but heavily clarified that my grandfather had explicitly left highly specific legal conditions in his ironclad will, and they had apparently just violently violated absolutely all of them. I specifically caught his use of the word we, knowing full well he strictly meant my parents had screwed up, so I aggressively stepped much closer to his desk and demanded to know exactly what those hidden conditions actually were. He deeply hesitated, nervously rubbing his sweaty forehead, and finally confessed that my grandfather had explicitly left a massive portion of the family estate securely locked inside a protected trust fund. He explained that there was a highly specific legal clause buried in the paperwork that automatically activates if one of his grandchildren is wrongfully cut off or completely abandoned by the family. His tight voice violently cracked as he looked directly at me and admitted that the specific child protected by that clause was actually me. The entire room instantly tilted on its axis as I quietly whispered, asking if the exact moment they publicly disowned me, they had inadvertently triggered the massive legal clause themselves. He shamefully nodded his head exactly as my mother suddenly appeared right behind me in the study doorway, physically shaking in pure terror, desperately begging me to help them fix this mess before they lost everything. Suddenly, a remarkably loud knock violently thundered straight through the entire house, consisting of 3 incredibly sharp, highly authoritative bangs on the front door. My father's face completely drained of all remaining color as he panicked and whispered that they were officially here. The aggressive knocking absolutely didn't stop, delivering 3 more booming hits that violently echoed straight through the massive mansion, exactly like warning gunshots in the dark. My father completely froze in place, my mother pathetically whimpered in the doorway, and Mia tightly clutched the staircase banister with stark white knuckles as I confidently walked right past absolutely all of them and headed straight downstairs. because suddenly, something massive inside my brain completely shifted, realizing that for the absolute first time in my entire miserable life, I absolutely wasn't the weak, powerless victim inside this toxic house anymore. I was officially the loaded gun, the active trigger, the legal clause, and the exact reason their entire arrogant empire was aggressively collapsing right on top of their heads, and they absolutely knew it. When I finally reached the grand foyer, two intimidating men, dressed in tailored coats, and a sharp woman carrying a heavy leather briefcase immediately stepped right inside the exact moment I opened the heavy door. They absolutely didn't ask for permission to enter, and they certainly didn't bother to politely greet my terrified parents standing on stairs. Instead, they just walked right in exactly like absolute owners actively reclaiming stolen property. The lead woman's sharp eyes instantly landed directly on me, and she calmly stated that I absolutely must be Alyssa Warren. Her professional tone was incredibly calm and highly respectful, which was absolutely nothing like the incredibly toxic way my own blood family usually spoke to me. I confidently confirmed that I was indeed Alyssa, while right behind me, my father desperately descended the grand stairs aggressively, trying to magically regain his lost control over the chaotic situation. He angrily barked that there was absolutely no need for their aggressive legal intimidation tactics and arrogantly claimed that they were already handling the minor misunderstanding internally. The sharp woman absolutely didn't even bother to look in his general direction, coldly informing him that he had explicitly been given 7 entire years to properly handle the estate, but instead, he had just aggressively violated absolutely every single legal stipulation of a federally protected family trust. She confidently announced that they were officially there to aggressively enforce my grandfather's final legal wishes without any further delay. My father's jaw violently tightened in pure rage, while my mother desperately gripped his arm, physically trembling with absolute terror. I spoke up in an incredibly even tone, asking the lawyer exactly what my grandfather had actually left for me. The professional woman calmly opened her heavy leather briefcase, slowly pulled out an incredibly thick legal binder, and gently placed it directly into my waiting hands. She looked me dead in the eye and stated that he had explicitly left me absolutely everything he owned, with the absolute sole exception of the primary family residence, which legally goes to my mother. She clarified that the entire rest of the massive estate, including all liquid bank accounts, high-yield investments, commercial properties, corporate business shares, and highly valuable personal assets, were immediately placed in an ironclad trust specifically for me under one highly specific condition. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs as I quickly flipped open to the very first page of the massive binder. The lawyer smoothly read the exact clause out loud, explicitly stating that the primary beneficiary absolutely must not be financially estranged, legally disowned, or publicly humiliated by her legal guardians. She clarified that any documented act of severe family rejection automatically and immediately transfers total control of the entire massive estate directly over to the primary beneficiary without any room for appeal. My mother violently gasped in pure horror, and my father aggressively swayed on his feet exactly as if someone had just brutally kicked his knees completely out from under him. I slowly looked right at my terrified parents and quietly asked the lawyer if dragging 200 relatives into a room specifically to humiliate me counted as a violation. The lawyer firmly nodded her head, legally confirming that by pulling that horrific stunt, they had officially surrendered absolutely everything, and she added that the federal court would permanently finalize the full asset transfer within exactly 10 business days. Absolute silence completely swallowed the entire foyer as pure power aggressively washed straight through my veins exactly like blistering heat right after a brutally long winter. For the absolute first time in history, my toxic parents desperately needed me to save them. And that is exactly when the massive for ultimate revenge took its true shape. It absolutely wasn't going to be incredibly loud, it certainly wasn't going to be petty, and it definitely wasn't going to be physically violent. No, it was going to be something significantly colder, perfectly clean, and infinitely more devastating to their fragile egos. My master plan was incredibly simple. I would actually agree to help them out, but absolutely not in the specific way they desperately hoped I would. I was going to systematically help them fully understand exactly what it truly feels like to completely lose absolutely everything they hold dear. And it was officially starting right now, but did I aggressively confront them right then and there? Absolutely not yet, because true devastating revenge is absolutely never just angry noise. It is entirely about calculated patience, actively watching the exact same toxic people who once aggressively controlled absolutely every single inch of your life suddenly have to frantically scramble to financially survive entirely without your explicit permission. The elite lawyers promptly left the house right after handing me all the binding legal documents, and the massive mansion instantly fell right back into a deeply fearful, suffocating silence. My father nervously kept violently wiping his sweaty palms aggressively on his expensive pants, which was a highly anxious tic I had absolutely never seen him do before. My mother silently stood right behind him, exactly like a highly fragile, broken shadow. Mia awkwardly hovered near the bottom of the grand stairs, looking incredibly pale, highly confused, and entirely lost. I calmly closed the heavy legal binder, securely held it tight against my chest, and confidently commanded absolutely all of them to sit down immediately. Astonishingly, they all instantly obeyed my command without a single word of protest. My God, they actually blindly obeyed me. My father awkwardly cleared his throat, desperately trying to project a fake aura of authority, and weakly suggested that we could easily negotiate some kind of internal deal to figure out a quiet solution that explicitly protects the pristine family name. I smiled an incredibly small, razor-sharp smile, and coldly reminded him that he had completely destroyed my personal name exactly 4 short days ago in front of everyone we knew. He violently flinched at the harsh reality check as I calmly took a comfortable seat directly across from them, slowly crossing my legs with highly deliberate, agonizing ease. I confidently stated that we desperately needed to talk about exactly what happens next in this transition. My mother desperately reached out her shaking hand, her voice violently trembling as she pathetically whispered that they had simply made a tiny mistake. I aggressively corrected her delusion, explicitly stating that they absolutely didn't make a simple mistake, but rather they maliciously orchestrated a massive public spectacle. I reminded them that they intentionally turned a family holiday into a brutal public execution, explicitly fired me, aggressively stole my car, and gleefully erased my entire existence right in front of 200 people, and pointed out the absolute hypocrisy that now that Grandpa's ironclad trust explicitly says I legally inherit absolutely everything, suddenly I magically matter to them again. Their deeply ashamed silence was absolutely all the answer I needed, so I calmly opened the heavy binder right back up to the transition clauses. I explicitly read the section stating that the trust grants me absolute, full legal authority over all asset management during the 10-day transition period, and I intentionally let that terrifying fact hang incredibly heavy in the dead air. I coldly translated the legal jargon for them, explicitly stating that for the next 10 days, I absolutely legally control their entire lives. My father anxiously leaned forward and desperately asked me exactly what I wanted from them to fix this. There it finally was, the exact desperate question I had literally waited my entire miserable life to hear him ask me. I confidently stated that I wanted absolute, unfettered transparency immediately, demanding full legal access to absolutely all the financial accounts, every single active loan, every hidden liability, and absolutely every single hidden financial mess they had swept under the rug. My father immediately stiffened, aggressively argued that there was absolutely no need for that level of intrusion. I violently interrupted him, coldly stating that there absolutely was a need, explicitly because they didn't just casually disown me, but they legally and financially disqualified themselves from managing the estate. Then I aggressively turned my death glare directly toward my terrified mother, coldly reminding her that she had violently ripped my childhood photos straight off the wall, so I fully expected her to personally restore every single one of them immediately, explicitly demanding every single frame put perfectly back on every single shelf. She swallowed incredibly hard and pathetically whispered that she would do it, of course. Then I gently turned to Mia and casually asked about the exact whereabouts of my stolen car keys, Isla asked. Her eyes violently widened in pure panic as she frantically stammered that she absolutely didn't mean to take it, desperately claiming that Dad had explicitly forced her to do it. I coldly stated that I was absolutely sure he did force her, but firmly demanded that she return the keys to my hand today regardless. Suddenly, a remarkably soft knock completely broke the heavy tension in the living room as the housekeeper nervously peeked her head in the door. She frantically whispered that the local press was actively swarming outside on the front lawn, and they were aggressively asking very loud questions about the massive estate lawsuit. My father instantly went completely white as a ghost. My mother violently grabbed his arm in pure terror, and I calmly stood right up from my chair. It was officially time for phase 2, which was the highly public part of their massive, devastating downfall. The exact moment I confidently stepped out onto the massive front porch, dozens of bright camera flashes violently exploded all around me, exactly like aggressive fireworks in the night. Frantic reporters completely crowded the manicured front lawn, aggressively raising their microphones and loudly shouting invasive questions that violently sliced straight through the freezing cold air. They desperately yelled, asking if it was actually true that I was the new sole inheritor of the massive Warren estate, loudly questioning if my arrogant parents had explicitly illegally violated a federally protected trust fund, aggressively asking for confirmation on the viral rumors that I had been brutally publicly disowned at a Christmas party, and desperately wanting to know if I was actively planning to press severe criminal charges against my own family. Right behind me, I could actively feel my terrified parents violently trembling in the doorway. The exact same arrogant people who had once gleefully paraded me around exactly like a massive family embarrassment were now pathetically shrinking and trying to hide securely right behind my own shadow. I calmly lifted a single hand in the air, and the entire chaotic crowd of reporters instantly quieted down to listen. My strong voice was incredibly calm, entirely steady, and highly practiced by an entire lifetime of silently swallowing immense emotional pain. I loudly stated directly into the microphones that I could officially confirm that my late grandfather's protected trust had indeed been aggressively violated by my parents. I confidently added that I could also legally confirm that the specific disownment clause had been successfully triggered, transferring the estate, and finished by stating that beyond those specific facts, I was currently cooperating fully with the ongoing legal process. A massive chorus of shocked whispers aggressively rippled straight through the hungry crowd as my father desperately rushed forward, his voice violently shaking with pure terror, begging me to stop talking and claiming that we absolutely didn't need to involve the public media in our private family business. But I simply slowly turned my head, aggressively meeting his terrified eyes with an absolute icy stillness that he absolutely couldn't penetrate or intimidate. I coldly reminded him that he was the exact one who eagerly involved the massive public first, explicitly bringing up his choice to invite 200 relatives to Christmas just to dramatically announce my fake bill and actively force my boss to fire me right in front of a massive crowd. I paused for dramatic effect before coldly stating that this public media circus was simply the direct, unavoidable fallout of his own highly toxic choices. The eager reporters instantly erupted into chaos again, shouting more frantic questions, but I absolutely didn't bother to answer any further. Instead, I confidently turned around and stepped right back off the porch, clearly signaling the briefest, most powerful end to the public's statement. Right behind me, the heavy front door violently slammed shut, and entirely inside the house, absolute chaos violently exploded. My terrified father aggressively paced around the foyer in frantic, erratic loops. My defeated mother loudly sobbed uncontrollably directly into her shaking hands. Mia just stood completely still, exactly like a statue, her voice barely registering above a tiny whisper as she desperately asked me exactly what happens to them now. I slowly looked at absolutely all of them, really deeply looked at them for the first time in my life, realizing that they finally felt incredibly small, highly breakable, and entirely human. I quietly whispered that this exact nightmare is exactly what total fallout actually looks like in the real world. My father violently rounded on me, his face red with rage, aggressively screaming that I was doing all of this on purpose just to deeply humiliate them. My jaw violently tightened as I coldly shot back that he was the one who brutally humiliated me first, and that right now he was merely experiencing exactly what karmic balance feels like. He violently slammed his clenched fist incredibly hard against the wooden table, desperately screaming that they could literally lose absolutely everything they owned. I calmly replied that they absolutely already did lose everything, explicitly stating that it happened the exact day they eagerly chose to completely destroy their own loyal daughter. My broken mother slowly stepped forward, her voice violently cracking, as she pathetically whispered that they were entirely wrong, deeply acknowledging their massive mistakes and desperately pleading that they simply didn't think it would end up like this. I coldly stared her dead in the eyes and firmly stated that they simply didn't think I actually mattered as a human being, but smoothly reminded them that legally, financially, and permanently, their entire arrogant world was now completely mine to control.